The noble consciousness thus finds itself in the judgment, confronting the state power in such a way that the latter is indeed not yet a self, but only the universal substance. It is, however, conscious of being the essence of that substance, its end and absolute content. Being so positively related to it, it adopts a negative attitude to its own ends, to its particular content and existence, and lets them vanish. This consciousness is the heroism of service, the virtue which sacrifices the single individual to the universal, thereby bringing this into existence. The person, one who voluntarily renounces possessions and enjoyment and acts as it is effective in the interests of the ruling power. Paragraph 503 is a very short paragraph, but there's actually a lot going on here when we unpack and think through, particularly with examples, what is happening in this dynamic that has to do no longer with both sides of self-consciousness, not just with the noble and the base, but just with the noble self-consciousness. From this point on, for the next several paragraphs, we're going to be looking at the relationship between the noble consciousness and state power. And Hegel is sort of setting the stage. He is not yet talking in exactly the same terms as he's going to use in the next few in terms of alienation, but we should read that into what's going on here. So he tells us that the noble consciousness finds itself in the judgment, confronting the state power in a certain way. So in its judgment, its Urteil on state power. Remember that the noble consciousness was engaged in a judgment about both state power on the one side and wealth on the other side. The base self-consciousness was also engaged in a judgment that had very different polarity to it, you could say. What's so unique about the noble consciousness? Well, in a certain sense, it identifies itself with the state power. Notice that Hegel's going to say something very interesting here, though. The state power is not itself conscious qua state power. He's going to reaffirm that in the next few paragraphs as well. It's going to have to come to consciousness. And you might say, well, wait a second, how does that happen? How is the ruling class or the ruler himself or herself not aware that they're actually in charge? They are aware that they're in charge, but they're not aware of themselves qua state power as a consciousness. They understand themselves as an individual who happens to be in the spot of state power for the time being. What we're talking about is the development of some new shape of consciousness, and we're not there yet. Right now we're looking at the side of the noble consciousness. So he says the noble consciousness finds itself confronting the state power in such a way that the latter is indeed not yet a self, but only the universal substance. And so this sounds very similar to what we have talked about in terms of the power of the community or the power of other things besides the state throughout this entire progress in spirit, in talking about the previous shapes of consciousness, and also going back into the reason section as well, where we saw, familiar terms like virtue. We're going to talk about virtue here. We had virtue and the way of the world. But before that, we were talking about ethical substance in general. So we're still talking about that here as the universal substance, that consciousness, the noble consciousness, is attempting to align and orient itself by and identify itself with. So the noble consciousness, how does it actually do this? There's the one side of the judgment, right? And, we should follow this out because this is the first thing that he talks about. He says that it is conscious of being the essence of that substance, its end and absolute content. Now, this is a little bit ambiguous in a statement, right? Is it that the noble consciousness finds itself to be the essence of that universal substance by making that judgment, by aligning itself with state power? Or is it discovering that the state power not only is the universal substance, but is also the essence, the thing that matters, the Wesen, the thing that has centrality and importance? Either one of those interpretations would actually work here in this probably intentionally ambiguous statement. And I put the same here in parentheses because we want to remember that what was determinative of the noble consciousness was finding a kind of sameness or Gleichheit, a similarity, a likening of itself to the state power. It wasn't just confronting the state power as those guys happen to be in charge. It was able to say, I buy into this. I find something here. Now, that's all really, in some sense, review of what has been going on. Here, in the rest of the paragraph, we're going to see how this determinately takes place. And this is where it gets really interesting as far as I'm concerned. Very suggestive. And it might be good to think in terms of a few examples here. So Hegel talks in terms of finding in the state power as he calls it, the end and absolute content, right? Its Zweck, its purpose, its goal, and absolute content, Inhalt, what it contains. So it finds a purpose. It finds a larger meaning within the scope of its relationship to the state. Now, what is its relationship to the state? Here's where Hegel puts his finger right on it. It has to do with the sacrifice of the ends of one's own, of the individual. The individual self-consciousness, the noble self-consciousness, precisely what makes it noble is that it sets aside its own ends and replaces those with a greater end, an end that is one of the entire society, or at least of those governing it, the ones, the archai, the archoi, the ones who are ruling, the ones who are directing, the ones who are determining, we could say. So he says it adopts a negative attitude towards its own ends, to its own particular content and existence. We'll talk about a few other examples, but let's do one example right here. Think of the military servitude that takes place when people are saying, okay, I am going to, let's take an ancient Rome, right? I'm going to leave my farm behind. I don't know whether the hired people that I have watching it are going to stay faithful to their orders and exercise some self-control and some prudence, or I'm going to come back to a farm that's totally devastated because as soon as I left, they ran riot. I'm going to take that chance. I'm also going to, grab my family arms and go out and march. I don't know if this guy running the show is actually smart or not, because it's his first set of battles too. But he's in charge, so I'm going to get into my unit as I'm supposed to and march out there with him, and we'll fight against the Samnites or the Volsci, or God forbid the Carthaginians, because they were pretty tough. And I'll risk death. I'll endure hardship. I'll carry all this stuff around on my back and sweat and eat terrible food and probably get, some dysentery along the way. And so what's going on there? All of these subordination of one's own particular happiness, one's own security, one's own ends, the things that are one's own particular content and even perhaps existence. One decides that those don't matter as much. One takes a negative attitude towards them. That doesn't mean that they don't exist at all. As a matter of fact, it's not really a sacrifice if what you're sacrificing doesn't matter to you. So they are given over to the greater end of the state where the person is finding him or herself. So he says he lets them vanish. This consciousness, and here we get something really interesting. This consciousness, Hegel uses two terms here, is the heroism of service. Heroismus des Dienstes, right? Doing what one ought to do. Where have we seen this service coming up before? Well, it goes all the way back to the master-slave dialectic. That was one of the things that the slave did, in fact, in relation to the Lord, or the master, or whatever you want to call it, right? The Herr. Here he talks in terms also of virtue. This is the virtue which sacrifices the single individual to the universal. Now, where have we seen that before? That was part of virtue and the way of the world. And in that section, virtue was not victorious, was it? The way of the world turned out to be victorious, and virtue, in the modern sense at least, turned out to be a kind of hypocrisy or an inability to realize these ends. What is going to be the case in this time? We'll have to see. Remember, too, that we're thinking historically about a long period of history where individuals are lining themselves in relation to state power, practically the whole Middle Ages in some respect, and going on to the Renaissance and early modern period, too, I would say. So he says, what happens? What is brought into existence? The person, one who voluntarily renounces possessions and enjoyments and acts, and is effective in the interests of the ruling power. So we have a movement here from self-consciousness to being a person, being a bearer of virtue, of service, an individual who is able to bring into being not just their own being, but also, in a certain respect, that of state power, as we're going to see in the paragraphs yet to come. So this is a quite important passage. We should think about what ends might be sacrificed. I said we would talk about a few examples. So let's think of some other examples. What about the person who doesn't go into military service but decides that they're going to give their counsel to the ruling class? And that means moving away, again, from their territory to that of the central government. What about the person who decides to give part of their land, or perhaps even doesn't choose necessarily to give it, but has it imposed upon them as taxes, but then rises to the occasion and says, you're welcome to it because I think you're going to do great stuff with this. Remember, the noble consciousness is not just that nothing is imposed on it, it's that it chooses to see things in a certain way, and that's what makes it noble as opposed to ignoble. Through this process, the universal becomes united with existence in general, just as the merely existent consciousness, through this renunciation, develops into an essential existence. That from which this consciousness alienates itself in serving the universal is the consciousness that is immersed in mere existence. But the being that is alienated from itself is the in itself. Through this development, therefore, it wins self-respect and the respect of others. The state power, however, which was at first only the universal in thought, the in itself becomes through this very process the universal in existence, actual power. This it actually is only in the actual obedience which it gets, through self-consciousness judging the state power to be the essence, and through the free sacrifice of self-consciousness to it. This action which unites the essence with the self produces the twofold actuality. The self that has a true actuality, and the state power is the true, which is acknowledged as such. Here in paragraph 504, Hegel, as in the previous paragraph, is going to be doing quite a lot, and he's going to finally explicitly use two very important terms that he's allowed to sit for a while. One of them is culture. It's being translated here as development, but Bildung, we've been playing around with that this entire time. The other one is alienation and Fremdung, which is what is happening that was described in the previous paragraph, still happening here in this paragraph. This sacrifice, the literally making oneself a sacrifice, Aufopferung. So what does Hegel say? He says, through this process, what is the process? What we just described in the last paragraph. The universal becomes united with existence in general. That's a good thing for Hegel, right? Just as the merely existent consciousness, through this renunciation, develops into an essential existence. So we saw this in the movement from the individual to the person through sacrifice. What's going on the other side? He says, the being that is alienated from itself is the in itself. Through this development, it wins self-respect and the respect of others. Now, this term respect, Achtung, is an interesting and ambiguous one because it also means something like attention. Pay attention to this. So it's not. It does mean respect. It does mean also deference, like when I'm going to give way to you. But it means attention. So what's going on here is what we earlier saw in much earlier back to the struggle for recognition is now being carried out through sacrifice. So the noble consciousness who behaves as the noble person get something out of it. And they don't just get something from others, they're able to have that relation to themselves as well. It's a gain for them. What's going on the other side? He says, the state power, which at first was only the universal in thought. That's an interesting thing to say. It was only a universal in thought, now becomes an actual power and a universal in existence, as Hegel says. He says it actually is only in the actual obedience which it gets through self-consciousness, judging the state power to be the essence. So with no person deciding to render obedience, deciding to exhibit virtue, deciding to engage in sacrifice, no real state power, just tyranny, just unfreedom, just one person exercising a kind of arbitrary power over another. But when somebody decides that they're going to buy in, they're going to treat this as something valid, something real, something worthwhile, they sacrifice their own ends to the ends of the larger community, now we have something important taking place. But it only takes place because of this judgment that is made by the individual person, or really by a whole bunch of individual consciousnesses. So he goes on and he says, through the free sacrifice of self-consciousness as happens, this action unites the essence with the self, and it produces a twofold actuality. This is an advance. The self that has a true actuality and the state power as the true, which is acknowledged as such. So we move from a point where these things are sort of figuring out where they fit in to a perceived truth on both parts. Through this alienation, however, the state power is not a self-consciousness that knows itself as state power. It is only its law or its in itself that has authority. It has as yet no particular will. For the self-consciousness that serves the state power has not as yet renounced its own pure self and made it the active principle of the state power. It has only given that power its mere being, has only sacrificed its outer existence to it, not its intrinsic being. This self-consciousness is deemed to be in conformity with the essence and is acknowledged on account of what it intrinsically is. In it, the others find their own essence exemplified, but not their own being for self, find their thought or pure consciousness fulfilled, but not their individuality. It therefore possesses authority in their thoughts and enjoys honor. It is the haughty vassal who is active on behalf of the state power, insofar as the latter is not a personal will, but an essential will. The vassal who knows himself to be esteemed only in that honor only in the essential representation of him in general opinion, not in the gratitude shown to him by an individuality, for he has not helped this individuality to gratify his being for self. His language, were he to stand in relation to the state power which has not yet come into being, would take the form of counsel imparted for the general good. Hegel begins paragraph 505 by talking again about alienation, meaning by this the alienation of noble self-consciousness of a part of itself. It's what he's going to call here its outer existence, its own intentions, its own desires, its own needs, but only in a certain way, as he's pointing out. He's talked a lot about how it's, sacrificing and obedient, but really this only goes to a certain extent. And state power is not yet developed, as he says, into a self-consciousness that knows itself as state power. So he starts out by talking about that side. He says, it's only its law or it's in itself that has authority. It doesn't have as yet a particular will. And what we're going to see here is Hegel is going to make a distinction between a particular will and an essential will. The particular will we can associate with a government, as he's going to tell us in the next paragraphs to come. And we don't yet have that, but what we do have is some sort of set of norms, some governing thing, right? So what's taking shape here is the development of rulership, of what we might call governance. On the other side, he tells us that self-consciousness serving the state power really has not renounced everything. It renounced its outer existence, which would be, as he called it, its own content, its own individual zweck, purpose, end goal, we could call that. But it found a goal in state power, right, to satisfy it. But what it holds on to is its pure self or its intrinsic being. And here Hegel tells us something really interesting. And again, we should, when we're thinking about where this fits in historically, everywhere from antiquity through the Middle Ages into the early modern period, he says that it's only sacrificed its outer existence. This self-consciousness is deemed to be in conformity with the essence, and it is acknowledged on account of what it intrinsically is. In it, the others are going to find their own essence exemplified, but not their own being for thought, for self. This is going to be a preoccupation in this passage and in the passages yet to come. Where is being for self? There's intrinsic being an sich. Where is the being für sich? Where you can actually reflexively relate to yourself. How do the others who are looking at this noble deed doer, the sacrificer, the one who stands out, how are they able to see themselves in there, reflected? They're not at this point. So they render what Hegel calls honor, because they grasp the person through thought. He says, it possesses authority in their thoughts and enjoys honor. It is the haughty vessel who is active on behalf of state power, insofar as the latter is not a personal will, but an essential will. Insofar as the state power is not an individual, as individual, telling them what to do, but is a representative of the community, of the state, they're A-OK with taking their orders, because in the process they gain something more important. They get to keep their essential self, and they get honor from everybody else, and indeed from the state power. But if the state power were a self-conscious individual telling them what to do, maybe now they wouldn't be quite so happy about it, because now it's subordination to an individual. So the haughty vassal, right? He says, the vassal knows himself to be esteemed only in that honor, only in the essential representation of him in general opinion. So even the vassal is not really experiencing being for self. They get esteemed for being that kind of guy, but not being that guy, right? A great example of this is, the Romans had these stories about famous men, the viribus illustribus, right? These are these stories of these guys who did great things, ranging from Romulus and Remus all the way to Decius Mus, all the way down to fairly close to the more historical era. And it recounted battles and people who opposed the Etruscan kings and legislators who introduced important laws, right? But in a certain sense, those people don't exist as people. They exist as names. They exist as characters. They exist as persons in that sense, personae, rather than as individuals. So that's what's going on here. And Hegel says it's not gratitude shown by an individuality. Why? Because this person, the noble self-consciousness, has not helped gratify has not helped this individuality to gratify his being for self. And here Hegel says something that sort of forecasts where we're going. He brings up language, Sprache, and he says that the language that the noble self-consciousness would use, were things developed as they should be, would be counsel, Rat. And we're going to see a very in-depth discussion of language just a few paragraphs from now in paragraph 508. Now in paragraph 506 that we're going to move into, we're going to see what's missing in this lack of counsel.